Twice in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus summarizes the law and the prophets. The first time is in chapter 7, verse 12, when he states the golden rule in these terms: so always treat others as you would want them to treat you. And then he adds, this is the meaning of the law and prophets. In the gospel text of today, after he explains about the question which he is asked, he adds at the end of his explanation, on these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets. In other words, Jesus is saying that the golden rule in chapter 7, verse 12, and what he says in the gospel text of today, chapter 22, verses 34 to 40, are a summary of everything that anyone can ask. What is the background of the law and the prophets? Jesus is asked a question. And the question that he is asked, notice, is only about the greatest commandment. He is not asked about great commandments. He is not asked about the plural. He is asked about the greatest commandment, which in ordinary language would be one commandment. But the Lord cannot restrict himself to one, because one is actually two and two is one. And when I say one is two and two is one, the Lord speaks about how the greatest commandment is loving God with every fiber of one's being, both the internal and the external love of God. And then he adds, the second resembles it. You must love your neighbor as yourself. If in chapter 7, verse 12, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, here you must love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, the love that we express, the actions that we perform, are a reflection of who we are, of who the neighbor is, and of who God is. And then Jesus continues, not only by giving the answer about the greatest commandment, but what might seem on the surface level as two commandments, but actually are one, because Jesus says the second resembles it, and then he says, this is the whole law and the prophets. The law was considered the Torah. The prophets were considered the Nevi'im. So Jesus is saying the Torah, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, and all that the prophets have spoken until Malachi are subsumed into this one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. And when you do that, you are loving God. The neighbor and love for neighbor is what we might term as the horizontal dimension of love. That is, those who are living around us. But now neighbor is a much, much broader term simply than human beings. We cannot but include, when we use the word neighbor, not only human beings, but the whole environment, the world around us. We have got to be those who love not only human beings as much as we love ourselves, but whether it is birds, whether it is animals, whether it is plants, whether it is trees. In other words, the whole of nature. We can exclude nothing in nature from the love that we must have. And so it's a reaching out in love. So when this horizontal dimension of reaching out in love is accomplished, then the vertical dimension of love, that is our love for God, is almost automatic. In other words, John in his first letter, chapter 4, verse 10, verse 20 puts it very beautifully when he says, if a person says that he or she loves God, but cannot love their neighbor, they are liars. And why are they liars? Because he says, how can you tell me that you love someone whom you do not see, when you cannot love those whom you can see? In other words, if our love for God has to be manifested in the truest sense of the word, then it is only manifested in love of neighbor. Will you show your love for God by loving not only other human beings, but the whole world as your own? Amen.